Hello, my name is Liz Thompson, and I am going to talk today about action research. This video is made for the EcoSTEM grant, but it's also a general look at action research. And I want to also point you to, there's a follow-up video on critical participatory action research, and I think those together are going to be useful for us in the work we're doing. So today I'm going to go over the steps in action research, and then I'm going to look at a particular example that might be present in our classrooms. So this is the sort of 6-step process, and I'm going to go through each of these things and look at how they apply to a classroom in trying to develop particular interventions that are working for student success. But I'm also going to show you how these are parallel to other processes that I'm sure you're familiar with. So the first step is idea. So you get an idea and you might then do it in your classroom. But in action research, what we do is we try to think about what theory might inform this intervention so that we can be very purposeful about the interventions we're making. Then we plan the intervention in quite a bit of detail. Then we do it. And then we collect information about this particular intervention, and then we adjust, repeat, or implement. And this is often thought of as a circular process. In other graphics of action research, it actually shows a circular process where this is a continuous thing that we do. Now, we already make changes in our classroom. Many of us think of good ideas or hear of a friend that did an interesting thing in the classroom. But what we usually do is we skip a couple steps in the action research. We have an idea, and then we do it, and then we might adjust, repeat, or implement. And looking at action research is just a little bit more rigorous application of this process. Another way that you might be familiar with this process is sort of a scientific method that you might use in your research life. So you get a idea, a problem, an issue, and then you look for the theory of this for this experiment, and then you plan the experiment, you do the experiment, you collect data on the results, and then you repeat it, or you adjust, or you publish. So this is familiar to many of us, of course, as we've learned science throughout our lives. Another example of a similar process is the engineering design process, where we get an idea or a problem or an issue, and then we spend some time investigating the background, context, or users. In engineering design, we don't always go to theory, but we do some background research. And then we go through the 3-step process of design, build, test, which actually can be mimicked through the plan, act, and then collect data. And then lastly, we adjust, repeat. So the engineering design process is very similar to action research also. Now, because in action research, we often skip these through these 3 steps, I'm going to go ahead and go through an example so that we can see how to apply all the steps. So an example might start with an idea. You announce in class that I have this idea that I'm going to announce in class that I encourage students to talk to each other in languages of their choice. And I might have heard other people talk about this idea of meeting people where they are. And so I think, this might be a good idea. And then, so what we're going to do next is, well, then what theory might inform this intervention? And in your community of practice, or actually just in some of the readings you've done, you might have ideas of theories. For me, I use a couple theories on an ongoing basis. One is the community cultural wealth, which is the idea that students come with a lot of assets to the education space, and that if we recognize those assets and design processes that will encourage those assets, that we will increase engagement and inclusion. And in this case, linguistic capital would be the one kind of capital that we would be thinking about if we're going to encourage students to speak in the language of their choice. Another theory that I often use is self-determination theory. In this theory, you design processes and pedagogies that take advantage of increasing intrinsic motivation. And there's 3 areas: autonomy, students can choose what they want; competence, that students get better and better at things, and so that is good for their intrinsic motivation; And then also relatedness, either relatedness to people in the class or relatedness to their life goals. And so I often look at this and try to design things with this in mind to increase intrinsic motivation. So I might use those two theories to inform the work that I'm doing. And then I would plan the intervention. And I would actually go through a complete design of experiment for the particular intervention. In this case, my research question is, if the instructor encourages the student to speak to each other in language that they're most comfortable in, does this increase intrinsic motivation and engagement and thus student success? My hypothesis is if the answer to the question above is yes, then I would see intrinsic motivation increase after the announcement. And the procedures is that I'm going to announce in class that I encourage you all to speak in a language you're most comfortable in. Unfortunately, I only know English, so I will need you to speak to me in English. I'm embarrassed about this limitation of mine, and repeat this for 3 days. And then for data collection, I'm going to administer the SIM survey, which I'll show you in the next slide, the day before the announcement, and then again a week later to see if it's changed at all, the type of motivation that students have in class. And then I'll calculate the scores on pre and post. And then the last step is I'll decide if I want to do this, if this intervention worked, and then maybe I'll continue in the future, or I decide on the next intervention. So data collection, I referred to this survey there called SIMS, which is Situational Intrinsic Motivation Survey. And it's 16 questions. It's pretty short, and it asks students to indicate if they agree, to what extent they agree on things. And then you can score this into 4 kinds of subscales: intrinsic motivation, identified regulation, external regulation, and amotivation. So intrinsic intrinsic means like intrinsic motivation. Identified regulation is the idea that you're doing something because it's good for you. External regulation is you're doing something because you're getting a reward or a punishment. And then amotivation is that you're not motivated. So what you do is you give this survey, and then you break the scores up into these 4 subscales. And you can see here I have the data that I collected before the intervention and then after. And you can see that initially there's kind of a bell curve, but then after the intervention it sort of was skewed to the right, which means that intrinsic motivation was increased and amotivation, extrinsic, was decreased. And that's exactly what I want. So I hope that showed you a little bit about action research, and then also an example of action research.